Welcome. This is the second program in the 2018-2019 KHC NEH Colloquium, Survivance on Turtle Island, Engaging with Native American Cultural Survival, Resistance, and Allyship. I'm Kat Griefin. I'm a professor in the Art and Design Department, focusing on gallery museum studies, and also the current KHC Curator in Residence. This program is supported by the National Endowment for Humanities Challenge Grant, and I also want to thank our interim president, Timothy Lynch, for his support of this and all the other KHC programs here. This is a year-long program series, and I also want to share that it's going to be leading up to a year-long exhibition that will open here at the KHC in fall 2019 that will be titled, similarly, Survivance and Sovereignty on Turtle Island, Engaging with Contemporary Native American Art. This colloquium and exhibition are organized in collaboration with the KHC staff. Thank you very much, Victoria, Joel, and Marissa, for all of your help on this project. In consultation with Diane Freyer, who's Osage Cherokee, with graduate curatorial fellow, Sophia Lago, KHC fellows, can you raise your hands if you're in the room, Barbara Kelly, Angelica Palmer, there you are, and Julio Meza. As well as students in the Gallery Museum Studies program. Can you identify Carla, Diana? Excellent. We are also very pleased to be forming a KHC community committee. So if there are folks who are here in the audience who've been docents for the KHC, who are part of the Survivor Group or other programs in the past, and would like to join us on a committee to assist with planning for the exhibition next fall, we would love for you to join us so you can speak to me at the end. Tonight's program this evening is very special because it is the event in our series where we have the speaker, Danyelle Means, who is also the consulting curator on the exhibition and on the whole colloquium. So she's been working with myself and the KHC staff and students over the last few months and will be working with us through this coming year and into the next year on all aspects. And today she's going to be speaking specifically about her own research. So we're very honored that she's working with us and is here all the way from Santa Fe this evening. Just to give you a little idea, a brief intro to our program. The colloquium addresses cultural survival and resistance of Native Americans and First Nations people in the face of genocide and mass atrocities, and thus connects very directly to the mission of the KHC. Survivance, the word in the title, is a central theme of the project, and a term which has come to encompass narratives of active survival and resistance in opposition to the idea of victimhood. Now, what is the Turtle Island in the series title? Turtle Island is the name given to this continent by the Iroquois Nation, the Anishinaabe, and the Lenape, the latter which are the first native group that was in this region where, and still is in this region, where Queensborough Community College is seated. Not unlike Noah's Ark rising from the waters, this indigenous creation story about Turtle Island tells us this continent came into being when a great girl turtle raised her back out of the ocean. So that's America is Turtle Island, and Turtle Island is America. As you may have already noticed, in this program series, we're looking to address survivance from an indigenous perspective, but also to draw connections to other communities of survivors and the local community of survivors who is very involved here at the center, and to relate to issues of repatriation, restorative justice, and allyship. With that in mind, I want to rewind to 2 years ago, fall of 2016, and share with you something that was happening then and maybe has spurred some things that are still happening today. Chief Arvil Looking Horse of Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota nations in fall 2016 called for other religious leaders and communities of faith all across the nation and across the world to join him and other indigenous peoples who were gathered at the time at Standing Rock in allyship against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was threatening to destroy ancient burial sites, sacred land, water, and life. Rabbis and religious leaders the world over responded to that call that fall. Rabbi Susan Goldberg from the Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles said, On Thanksgiving, we stood at the edge of the water, so her and rabbis and other religious leaders. We stood at the edge of the waters running through the land. We stood in support of peoples who are not our own, but whose claims to protect their land and their lives we deeply understood. We stood in hope and we stood in prayer. So this spring, as part of the colloquium, we will have Standing with Standing Rock on allyship in the environment, and we'll have one of the rabbis who was there at the time, as well as some of the other participants. So this colloquium and the whole curatorial team here has been trying to think about this question of allyship and connecting communities and weaving this into all of our programming and certainly into tonight's program. So, now for tonight's program. Very briefly, I'm pleased to introduce Angelica, who will be introducing Danyelle Means more fully. Angelica is a student in the Gallery Museum Studies program at QCC and a current KHC fellow. She has interned at the Whitney Museum of Art, the New York Historical Society, and Soho 20. Angelica will start with a brief land acknowledgement before introducing Danielle. By acknowledging the land, and the people who were here before us and whose land was forcibly taken, we will offer respect and recognition. Angelica.
Thank you, Kat. Hi, everyone. I'm Angelica Pomar, and I'll be mediating today's discussion and lecture. As Kat mentioned, I'm one of the fellows of KHG's upcoming exhibition. Thank you all for coming to our second program of the season, the Collecting and Display of Contemporary Native American Art, with our lecturer today, Danyelle Means. Before beginning the program, I would like to take a moment to make a land statement that pays respect towards all the strong and resilient Indigenous individuals who occupy this land that we are meeting on today. Now, with that being said, I'm going to be sharing a short bio with you all about our lecturer, Danyelle Means. Danielle was born and raised on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. Danyelle Means is a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation with a family deeply engaged in cultural activism and awareness. Both her professional and academic career has been guided by the desire to ensure that cultural heritage of the people native to the continent be preserved, enhanced, and better understood for the good of all. Danielle worked at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, NMAI, where she began in 1992. Over her tenure at NMAI, she was a part of the planning and design of the museum's flagship venue on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. She helped with the transportation of the collections first to Lower Manhattan, then to Suitland, Maryland. She accompanied tribal consultations in accessing objects from their cultural patrimony and was privileged to be asked to participate in a repatriation ceremony. Finally settling into the exhibitions department, Danielle project managed several exhibitions at the museum's New York venue and onto national tours. After leaving NMAI, Danielle has continued to work as a consultant for the museum. The most recent engagement being in 2015, where she worked to develop educational resource information in conjunction with an upcoming exhibition, Native NY, Where Nations Rise. This exhibition will focus on the history of the indigenous inhabitants of what are now the 5 boroughs of New York, and will be permanently displayed in Lower Manhattan. In addition to the work with NMAI, she has consulted on several other projects and worked with academic institutions on issues of Native American cultural heritage, object preservation, exhibition development, as well as wider representation through educational programming. Having completed her coursework in Florence, Italy, Danielle is writing her master's thesis on the collection and display of contemporary Native American art in European museums. She's the mother of 3 young men and currently lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Danielle is also the co-curator and consultant with our upcoming exhibition, Survivance on Turtle Island. I also have worked with Danielle last spring during the beginnings of the exhibition process in my art curating class with Kat Griffin. From my experience, she presented many amazing and exciting ideas that challenged the way I viewed Native American contemporary art, especially regarding repatriation. Having said that, I'm especially excited to have her here today so she can share her great insight and we'll be able to discuss these very fascinating topics with all of you. Today in our lecture, Danielle will be sharing her insight, as I just mentioned, on the various issues surrounding contemporary art today through her research on museum collections and exhibition practices. For her research, Danielle will be presenting many contemporary indigenous artists who will have interpreted the way of contemporary art through their identity in both today's society and in the art world. Specifically, Danielle is interested in the responses and perceptions of people who view these exhibitions with indigenous contemporary art. This program will be intended to be more of a discussion. The impact of how this information is reciprocated through the audience is equally important as the lecture Danielle is going to present to us. So please feel free to ask questions and definitely do not be shy to comment on the various issues that will arise. There will be a mic that will be passed around on either sides for anyone who wants to speak. But it's important that you raise your hand before you decide to speak, and the mic will be passed your way. So with that being said, also make sure that you fill out the surveys as a way to respond back to the institution and a way to give us feedback on what you thought about today's program. So now I'm going to shift your attention to Danielle and we'll officially begin the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. Thank you, Kat. I'm going to put this down here. I also want to acknowledge the First Peoples here. One of the things that we do as Native people is when you come to someone else's territory, you make sure that you thank them for their hospitality and understand that you are on their territory now. And so I want to thank the Lenape peoples, all of the peoples that we may not know who lived here before, and just thank them for allowing me to be a part of tonight's program. So now, oops, wrong way. One of the things that I was doing while I was in Florence for my master's program, I was trying to figure out what and how I could write about Native peoples while I was in Europe. And one of the things that I really was struck by was that most of the art that was representative of my people and of other Native nations was that the art was typically in an ethnographic setting. And by ethnographic, I mean most of the time it was lifeways. So you'd see pottery and more objects that were collected by colonial representatives. And it struck me that the modern Native wasn't represented anywhere in Europe, or very few places in Europe. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was try and figure out what are the collecting and display practices of some of the larger museums. In my talking to curators and directors of these museums, one of the things that I found out was that they do have collections of contemporary Native American art. They're just not on display. And one of the things that made my focus so important was that I wanted to see those objects put on display in reaction to what was being represented as my culture. So some of the things that I want to talk about here is we're in New York, we're not in Europe. And so I wanted to look at some of the things that are here now that everyone can go and visit. This is the Met, and this particular gallery holds Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, which is basically 2/3 of the entire globe. And I thought one gallery is representative of all these different people. And it's a little frustrating because I know that there are hundreds of contemporary artists that have voices that need to be heard. This is a photograph of an exhibition in 1941 at MoMA. And as you can see, these gentlemen who are doing sand painting as representative of contemporary Native art are literally on display. And this is shocking to me now. I guess you could call it performance art, but at the time, it definitely is more voyeuristic, more focused on them as an other. And very much frustrating. This is a current exhibition at the National Museum of the American Indian down in Lower Manhattan on Bowling Green. This is where I used to work. These are collections that I worked with often. One of the things that's difficult for a museum like the National Museum of the American Indian is that this is what people come to see. They want to know the breadth and depth of the collection. They want to know what are the objects, who are the people. And for a collection like this particular collection, it is all of the people of the Western Hemisphere, including Hawaii. And that's difficult to show. And you don't want to leave people out. The collection has over 800,000 objects. It's difficult to be able to break those things down. So it ends up becoming very similar to the displays that are in Europe and across Europe. But this doesn't tell me anything about contemporary Native peoples and what they're doing now, how they're expressing themselves artistically. And so it's still a little frustrating for me. Right next to that gallery is a gallery currently, until January of 2019, an exhibition of contemporary Native art that is completely new and fresh and electronic, which is, again, we're bringing Native people into a modern age. They're not objects that are from 150 years ago. These are contemporary artists. This is Ann Nicholson, and the name of this work is Harbinger of Catastrophe. And the work itself, the light moves up and down inside what is very similar to a bentwood box from the Northwest Coast where she's from. And it talks about the rising water and how the rising water can take over. And what is great about this particular piece is that it shows that it's an ebb and flow. It's a tide. And for many of us here in New York, with recent hurricanes, this really does talk about the cycle of life and how things can change in a matter of days. And I do think that this is something that we need to recognize, that these same kinds of traditions, the same cycle of life can be shown and displayed in a much more modern context, and yet still very close to her culture. In that same exhibition space is another work by Raven Chacon, who works in both sound and light. This particular piece of his talks about the cycle of life as well, and his way of representing day and night and the different colors that are associated with that. This gallery changes over the entire day. So from when the museum opens at 10 a.m. until 5 p.m. when it closes, the colors represent the dawn, the daylight, the evening, and the night. And so it is those four concepts. It's also about the creation story, and each of those are speakers, and all of the story is spoken in not only Navajo, but it's also spoken in English. And that story is repeated over and over and over again to talk about how we are generations over and over and over again. And these are the kinds of works that Native people are doing now. And it's important for everyone to see that, because we aren't just the pots and the hide shirts and the things of the past. There we go. This is a ledger drawing. Really, modern painting and modern forms of art, European forms of art, were introduced after the Indian Wars and after the implementation of reservations. So a lot of the pictorial, introduction to pictorial representation came along the lines of this, giving Native people paper and pencil to express themselves. This is representative of the Pueblo watercolors. Also, very early on, 1930s, Pueblo people were given, again, paper, watercolors, to try and represent this sort of very two-dimensional version of their ceremonies. A lot of what happened there was started by different schools that took Native people, Native children, young people in and encouraged them to do their art. One of the things that was a little frustrating for some of the students of this was that there was a definite idea of what Native art was supposed to look like. You were supposed to draw your ceremonies. You were supposed to draw these kinds of colorful activities that you were a part of. What ended up happening was that a young painter by the name of Oscar Howe, who is one of my, he for me represented a successful, he was Dakota, a successful Dakota man as an artist and as a celebrity in South Dakota when I was a young person. He represented success for me, that as a Native person, you can hold on to your heritage and still be a part of the larger society. One of the things that happened with Oscar Howe was that he had entered a Native art show, and he had sent one of his works and was sent back a letter saying that it wasn't Native enough. It didn't look Native enough. And this was his response: are we to be held back forever with one phase of Indian painting, with no right for individualism, dictated to us as the Indian has always been, put on reservations and treated like a child, and only the white man knows what is best for him? And it signaled a change, that there were very interesting and unique ideas that ended up becoming a part of this larger idea of contemporary Native American art. This is one of Oscar Howe's paintings. And again, you can see it's not the two-dimensional, it's representative of the movement of these birds. It's representative of the colors that are a part of life. It's not static. Another one of his paintings, The Seedgatherer, again, using color and movement and expression that wasn't traditionally Native, traditionally didn't look like you're supposed to. You were being represented in other galleries. Some of the other artists that ended up. Let me go back to Linda. Uh-oh. See if she's there. There we go. Oh, well, she's not. She doesn't want to be there. That was Linda Lomahaftorah, and she is Hopi and an artist that again was a young woman and trying to break out of this idea that she had to do art in one particular way. She and a number of other artists, T.C. Cannon, why are they going away?
Can someone from the tech side take a look at?
Yeah. Okay. I'm not, okay. So T.C. Cannon doesn't want to see you either. But T.C. Cannon was an artist, again, who wanted to push boundaries, who wanted to be inspired by contemporary American artists and be seen as a contemporary American artist. And that was new, to be not categorized as a native artist and to show himself with it. That was his own self-portrait. Okay, he was there briefly. Okay. They're all disappearing.
We're working on the technical issue.
That's all right. And so anyway, Harry Fonseca. Harry Fonseca is another artist. Again, breaking away, particularly, if you saw that briefly, that was a coyote, and using some of those symbols, using some of the, what you would see as maybe native or understand as native, recognize as native, and being able to pull it into a much more pop art, much more contemporary version of it. Coyote is often the trickster, often someone who's trying to get one over on everyone else, and that is exactly what those trickster, the trickster images were a part of. Oh, well, Frank's going to stay. This is Frank Buffalo Hide, and again, along the lines of the pop art, using these images of what is recognizably native and what is recognizably contemporary. So everyone can see that this is an iPhone. But again, Frank, with his name, Frank Buffalo Hide, he actually has a theme going through a lot of his work with the buffalo, playing on, again, the idea of playing on his name, how that represents Native people, how that's recognizably native, but at the same time wanting to stretch himself in terms of art and go into a much more pop art arena. This is Edgar Heap of Birds. Edgar is an artist who was here in New York City in the late 70s and early 80s. What Edgar noticed is that he was on land that was native, and yet there was no representation of native. And so he started these series of one-liners that really kind of make you think. So if you read a couple of those, it reminds you that we're still here, that there are native issues that are everyone's issues. And really, one of the things that is very unique about Edgar is that he refuses to explain his work. And you have to get what you get from his work. Please come back. Okay. Okay, that was Chris Papen. And Chris is a contemporary ledger artist. Like those first images that I showed you with the horse on the piece of paper, very static, two-dimensional. Chris's work is work that is it's ledger art brought to a whole other level. All of his work is done in pencil. All of his work is hand-drawn. But what he ends up doing is he'll take those images, and if you saw it briefly, was 3 versions of that same woman, and they're all hand-drawn, and they're all just a little bit stretched, just a little bit made to look unreal, and yet they're so very realistic. And Chris, his work is really one of the oh, there she was. His work was really one of the most significant new ledger art that's coming out. That's Monty. Monty Little. Monty was a student at IAIA, which is Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. And I met Monty several years ago as a college student, much like some of you here, who was trying to figure out where his art was going. Monty was given a scholarship to attend a summer program in Venice, Italy, and study there for 5 weeks. And one of the things with Native people is we've become very comfortable on our reservations. We've become very comfortable in our Native bubble. And the Institute of American Indian Arts is a way for younger Native artists to stretch themselves a little further and move into a more modern and more contemporary art venue. One of the things that that was significant with Monty is that his tenure in Venice, for him, opened up an entire new world of art, and being able to experience that as a Native person, being able to go and see the Mona Lisa in Paris and be able to see all of these things that were only ever represented in books and only ever something outside of themselves. Being able to go and experience all of that, be a part of the Venice Biennale, be a part of that contemporary Native art. He now describes his art as works that he did pre-Venice and works that are post-Venice because of the connections that he had with what he saw in Europe.
Danielle, because you said we could ask questions
Yes.
during, I have a statement and a question. And the statement is that we have a tech person coming to fix the problem. And so what I thought was that this might be an opportunity to ask a few questions.
Sure.
And have a little conversation and then go back into the imagery so you don't have to, though you have so beautifully done it, describe to us with what you're seeing. So I'll start with just a very basic question.
Sure.
How did you decide of all of the hundreds of thousands of incredible artists that you could be showing us today as part of this conversation, which artists to include?
Well, it was very difficult. As you say, there are so many contemporary Native artists, and just trying to share as many of them as possible was really my goal here, and in as many different formats. Some of them are personal friends, some of them, their work speaks to me, and some of them are controversial. I wanted to be able to show you the breadth and depth of what contemporary Native art is. And again, as you say, Kat, and you obviously being in the field, there's so much out there to see. If anything, I would want you to Google contemporary Native American art. If I get you to do that alone and just see what images pop up and see what you like, what who these artists are, go to their websites, go and see where their art has been displayed. That to me has been a good introduction to contemporary Native art. And again, one of the things is I didn't get to choose. I could have had 150, 200, 300 slides of different artists, and I could probably talk to you for 10 minutes on each of them. So,
and hopefully we'll definitely get to a little more of that. Is there any other questions so far about some of the work that we've been seeing in some of the exhibition materials? I'm going to pass you the mics.
We didn't get to see the slide, but you described Chris's work as ledger art. What is
ledger
that?
art. So ledger art was as Native people were put on reservations. A lot of the artists, specifically in the Plains area, a lot of those artists were artists that had painted on hides or painted on canvas. There was very rarely and canvas meaning canvas teepees. And so with ledger art, literal ledgers, which you kept calculations on, once they were no longer useful or had been discarded, they'd be collected by Native people or by missionaries or by agency, the reservation agents, and given to people to draw on. So a lot of the historic ledger art that you see is actual old ledgers, and you can see the calculations on them, and they're painted over top of that. So that's where the ledger art comes from. Chris actually likes to try and find those old ledgers and draw on them. So they're actual pieces of old ledger books that he does a much more contemporary version of.
Are there other questions?
No? Nothing? Okay.
Okay. So I just wanted to ask, in regards to Native American art today, do you see any trends, like specifically with how artists present their work, such as like subject matter or like style? I know you were saying beginning with Oscar's work, and his work is abstract. So, like for example, veering away from like traditional ways of making Native art or whatever that may be, Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. As far as seeing trends, I think people are experimenting with a lot of different techniques. In some of the other slides that hopefully we'll be able to see, there are textile art, fashion. Fashion is a big part of the contemporary Native art world right now. Jewelry design. So it doesn't just stay in what we may think of traditional Western art, sculpture, painting. It branches out into a lot of different things. And I think that's representative of Native people in general, in that a lot of our art was wearable art, especially when you're looking at the Plains, which is my people. When you had to travel with what you had, oftentimes adorning yourself, whether it was with beads or hide, any kind of different shell that you would trade for, all of those things, it became a much more wearable art. So fashion is a big part, it for me is a big trend in Native American art, contemporary art. Do we got it?
I'm going to double check that we're back in action. I think we may be. So maybe I'll just give you one more question while we confirm that. Is there any specific examples of museums that you visited in Europe that you thought were better or worse, or for what reasons better or worse, made better or worse curatorial decisions of how to display the collections of the contemporary work that they did actually put on view?
Yes. Randomly, I came across a small museum in Zurich, Switzerland, and that particular museum had work that I hadn't seen before, contemporary Native work. And the show itself was called Native Art Now, and I was so impressed with the curator's selection of particular pieces. Basically, she had selected artists, again, that I had never seen before, whose work really spoke to this idea of contemporary art, abstraction. Jeff Comm was one of the artists who does these very linear, abstract pieces. Another artist was Chinupahanska Luger, who we'll see at the end here. And I hadn't seen these artists before, and that was shocking to me, to be in Europe, to be kind of finding frustration in not seeing contemporary art, and then seeing an exhibit which was just the wildly opposite. This was contemporary art. It had so many new and upcoming artists. It was just fascinating to me. One of the things that was on the other end that was very frustrating is there's a museum that was put together around a German author by the name of Karl May. And Karl May wrote books in the 40s and 50s, I believe. Oh, there's Chris Papen. But Karl May's museum is a museum of the plains, and he wrote about Winnetou, and Winnetou was this native who was kind of a Tonto character, Lone Ranger character, and at the Karl May Museum, they display things like scalps, and they display things like human remains, and they display a version of Native peoples that is disrespectful in my view. And also they do a program where there's a man, they have an outdoor amphitheater, and there's a man who paints his face brown and wears leather clothing, and he saves the white maiden, and it's a program. And it's all about, how this Native person is a good guy. What's even worse is that Karl May never came to the U.S. Karl May never saw Native people in person. Karl May had an idea of what Native was, and that was exported by the U.S. to post-war Europe, and that's frustrating. That is really a difficult part of how, especially the Plains people, are represented. So that the two extremes, Zurich, contemporary art, you wouldn't think was Native, and Karl May, we're back to the Western. So this is Chris Papen, and Chris, again, you can see at the top there, right across her forehead, is where the ledger part of the paper is. And again, he's not just doing a simple pencil drawing. He's so incredibly talented. It looks as if this is repeating like a photograph would repeat. It's his ability to be able to make these images abstract and stretched and it really is incredible.
The good news is it seems that we've found a workaround solution, and the problem should be fixed very shortly. Can you try going to the next one, and we'll see if we have it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Monty's there.
Yeah.
And Monty was a student that went to Venice, and his work really did end up evolving. And he's stretching himself even now. This is post-Venice work, but he's now even working in different medium. This, I believe, was a acrylic painting. He moved to oils. He's done a lot of different things, and is a very young man. And so I look forward to a lot of great things from him. This is Star Hardridge, and Star. It's hard to tell from these images, but Star uses pointillism. So each one of those is a tiny dot of paint, and it makes up the whole picture. And when you see it up close, he does a varnish over top of it. It looks like beadwork on the canvas, and it's exquisite. You want to touch it. It's absolutely beautiful. And he's Muskogee Creek, and he uses a lot of imagery, both in the dragonfly, but also in the silhouettes of people. And his work is just it's unique and new and colorful, and I'm a big fan of his work. This is Kay Walking Stick, and Kay, like Edgar Heap, was in New York in the 80s and was introduced to a lot of the art scene in New York. She's become very successful, and a lot of her work is representative of where she's from, and she's really has evolved as an artist, using color and landscape and abstraction to be able to show her heritage at the same time being very approachable. This is Emmy Whitehorse. Emmy, again, abstract designs. Does this read as native to anyone? Does this read as this is a Native woman artist? For me, it doesn't, and I like that about it. I like that she is an artist and expressing herself, and doesn't have to have those pigeonholes of a Native artist. Doesn't have to have a horse or a feather to define who she is. Even though when her work is written about, and you see the imagery, and you can pull out those designs that are Native inspired, it then has a whole nother life. It has a whole nother version that you can then see, and it's all about your perception of how this work is viewed. This is one of our more controversial artists. This is Kent Monkman. And Kent is Cree from Canada. He's First Nations. And one of the things I love about Kent is that he has taken the landscape, the grand landscape paintings of, for instance, the Hudson River Valley School, some of the Western art that you would see as these like virgin landscape paintings for Manifest Destiny and Westward Expansion and all of these things, ours for the taking. And what Kent has done is he's taken a little bit of a spin on it, and he's created this figure, and her name is Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, and she wears her high red boots, thigh-high red boots, and she's usually in the act of keeping non-native people from spoiling the landscape. And so you see the missionary on the right, you see the soldiers, you see Mount Rushmore in the background. And it is her destiny to keep the native people native. This is also a work by Kent Monkman. And again, you see how versatile some of these artists are, and some of the work that they do is extraordinary. This is Rick Bartow. Again, abstracting some of these ideas and yet having the imagery. He could be compared to a number of American artists, or European artists for that matter. This is Norval Morso, and Norval is also First Nations. Norval was one of the artists that transcended a little bit into a more accessible version, especially in France. He was sort of celebrated as a contemporary artist. And there was a time in the 50s where several artists had been accepted by the U.S. Embassy to display their art, and had been an exhibit of their work had been taken around Europe. Norval, again, such a unique take on his heritage, and this I believe is titled "Shaman Talking to the Animals." And again, he taking those stories, abstracting them, making them colorful, and using form line design, which is a part of his heritage as well. These works are just, I believe, these works are things that should be put next to some of the more contemporary galleries and art museums in the world. This is Rebecca Belmore, and Rebecca is a fantastic artist who challenges you to rethink your idea of what Native is. This particular work is called Fringe, and a lot of contemporary Native dancers used fringe in their regalia, and fringe being part of what we have on our hide shirts. This really does speak to that idea of being alive and still having this kind of surgery done to you. Marie Watt. Marie's work is incredible. Again, this is textile art, and it just is, for me, it is haunting. The blankets. When I see this work, I think of all of the blankets that were given out in those days, infected with smallpox, infected with disease that wiped out so many Native nations. And it's just representative for me of that connection to all of how we are surviving, and who was lucky enough not to get one of these blankets. It's haunting for me. This is Bob Houses, and Bob's work is again, he uses a material that cast bronze and paint, and talks about, why aren't we a part of the national landscape? Why are we skipped over? And a lot of his work is is more, has a lot of struggle within it. Bob is also the son of Alan Hauser. And Alan Hauser, again, was a part of that movement in pre-World War II of, is that native? Your work, how does that say you're native? And that, challenging those ideas of what native is, what and how we see contemporary native art. He was a contemporary of Oscar Howe, who actually challenged the idea of what native art was. This is Diego Romero. This is a pot. And Diego's work, again, using some of those same techniques that he was taught for Pueblo coil pottery, but taking the design to a whole other level. So again, you can recognize this is, video games. And yet, do you see underneath the TV and underneath where they're sitting are the remains of what their ancestors taught them, and they're ignoring it. And so it brings up all of these issues of where and how we're raising our kids. What are we teaching? How do we pass on these traditions? And are we missing out? This work is by Courtney Leonard, who is Shinnecock from this area around the Hamptons. Courtney's work really talks about the idea of loss and of trying to reclaim something that you may not be able to. These are ceramic, what she calls her ceramic whale teeth. And so the Shinnecock Nation was a nation of whalers. And for her, this represents the loss of their connection to the ocean, to how they used to function. And it with Courtney, a lot of what she does is about environmental issues, climate change, bringing awareness to what is going on in our world, and being one of the nations that has remained here in New York as a viable tribe, continuous tribe here in New York. This is Preston Singletary, and all of those are made out of glass. Preston is a glass artist, and his work represents a lot of the Alaskan basketry and carving, and it really is incredible. This is a house front that Preston has done. Those two pieces on the sides, the yellow and blue sides, they're over 7 feet tall, and it's all cast glass. And with Preston, he's taken that form that would be made out of wood and paint, and he's taking it to a whole other level. And the glass house front really making you think about these things and what they're made of and how they function and had functioned in a contemporary society. This is Erica Lord, and for me, this piece is a big part of the struggle of Native peoples. Erica has on the top photographs, which she's pieced together, a equation of how blood quantum is calculated. And all of us who are enrolled have a fraction of how much we are enrolled. And then we also have a number that is our enrollment number, which is the bottom number. And for me, it has always been an unfair calculation, because the idea of blood quantum, the idea of enrollment was couched in this exclusivity, that you were enrolled on a particular reservation. Well, my father's parents were from 2 different tribes. So that calculation on the top was, one is 1/4 native from one tribe, and the other is another quarter native from a different tribe, or a 1/16 of a different tribe. I had that same issue. Well, my mom is not native, but my father is full blood, and my calculation is only calculated on one tribe. And so my grandmother's, all of her nativeness was discounted. And that is frustrating to me. And I think that's one thing as Native people we've struggled with. We've adopted this as, well, I'm an exclusive member of this tribe, whereas we should be accepting everyone who has heritage, who has a connection to who we are. Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the enrollment process and why it exists?
So enrollment, basically once the reservation system was established in 1890, enrollments were based on blood quantum. And so you would have a certain amount of a particular tribe, and that would designate how native you were. So as the boarding school system began being put in place, and these Native children were taken from their homes, as they grew up in these boarding schools, they would obviously fall in love, probably like a few of you have done here. And when they establish those families, they're from different tribes. Now you go back to your reservation, depending on which reservation you wanted to go back to, and your children are only 1/2 of what you are. And yet you're both full-blood natives. And that designation of how those fractions get marked was a way to assimilate Native people into a larger society, because at some point you're not going to have enough Native to be Native. So for instance, my children weren't allowed to be enrolled on my home reservation because they didn't count my other half. So I was only 1/4, and you have to be at least 1/4 to be enrolled on a reservation. So as those policies are, and these are policies that the U.S. government has implemented in order to make Natives disappear. In 1951, the Indian Termination Act. It's a policy of how to displace Natives off of reservations, to assimilate them into larger society, to get rid of their nativeness. Sterilization at Indian agency hospitals, all kinds of different issues that this for me represents. That tattooed number is something I have to tell people about if I want to designate myself as Native. I need to have my enrollment number in order to designate that. And so you think about it, you think, well, we're America, we're the land of the free, home of the brave, religious freedom for all. Well, in 1978, Native people were finally given the right to practice their religion. I thought we had freedom of religion far before that. 1978, I was 10 years old in 1978, and we were now free to practice our religion. These are the things that we don't talk about. These are the things that a lot of these artists are trying to convey, things that we've grown up with that are something that we need to express. And this is Shan Goshorn, and Shan is Cherokee, and Shan did not grow up on the reservation, and yet she came back to her grandmother and her aunts on the reservation and learned how to basket weave as a way to connect with her family, as a way to reconnect to her roots. What Shan ended up doing was, and it's hard to convey this with her work. Each one of those strips is actually photographic paper, and she has woven in treaty words and images and photographs so that when she weaves the basket, those images reconstitute, and they're images on the front and the back. She's talked about violence against women, indigenous women. She's talked about boarding schools, all through her basketry, and the words are handwritten on each splint of each basket. And the idea that she has the ability to see these designs and using her traditional designs and traditional weaving techniques to then allow these photographs and these words to be interwoven together. Her work is just extraordinary. And again, something else that you wouldn't necessarily think of as art or fine art. This is actually, it would more likely be called folk art. This is Margaret Wood, and Margaret Wood is a textile artist. This is a quilt. And this is, I believe this is a 6 foot quilt. She is actually working on, this is one image of a 40-foot quilt that she's making of her home landscape. And it's all hand quilted, it's all hand pieced, and she uses the fabric to express the different colors and shapes and designs that are a part of her homeland. We're talking about fashion. These boots are extraordinary. All of those, that is actually beadwork. So those are all tiny little seed beads. And this is an artist named Jamie Okuma. And what Jamie wanted to do, Jamie's a fashionista. These are Louboutins. So she loves her fashion, but she also loves to express herself through beadwork. And one of the things that she found herself doing was beading her tennis shoes and beading her belts and beading all of these different things, and finally decided, you know what, let me try and do this on these boots. These boots are absolutely extraordinary. They have the swallow design, and the swallow is representative of new life and excitement and energy. And you can obviously see she put in a tremendous amount of work and energy into those boots. This is Shosho Esquiro, and Shosho is from the Yukon Territory. She's, I want to say Inupiaq, but might not be. I'm not quite sure of her tribe. But Shosho uses the materials that are native to her area. The bodice part is made of sealskin and seal fur. The belt area is made of carp skin, and the feathers are all from birds native to her area. She wants to incorporate those things to give you a sense of who she is, and yet it is an exquisite piece of fashion. And for me, it is just an amazing art piece. And actually, the National Museum of the American Indian bought this piece for their collection. Douglas Miles, graffiti art is definitely something that has developed on the reservations and within the urban landscape. And so as a lot of these displaced Native people were in Oakland and Cleveland, New York, Denver, Minneapolis, Seattle, as they were displaced, the idea of graffiti art definitely developed as a way to express yourself. Douglas now does a lot of his art, has become a more commercial artist in doing his art on T-shirts and skateboards and other things that he can then, commercialize. And yet his work remains on the reservation as stunning pieces. This is an artist, Ian Kuali'i, and he's Native Hawaiian. Ian actually works in stencils, and so as a graffiti artist, he used to cut the paper and then tag everything. Now he's being paid to do it. But some of his work in paper was so intricate. This is actually stenciled paper cut out and placed on wood. He's become an artist that has developed this new technique of paper art and representing some of the imagery from his homelands in Hawaii. This is Chinupa Hanska Luger, and Chinupa is an artist that wants to bring attention to a lot of different ideas and issues surrounding Native people. This bead curtain is actually 2-inch, I guess they're about 2 inches, clay beads that were made all across the United States by a variety of different pottery guilds and sent to Santa Fe to be fired and then painted and refired to make up this beadwork curtain to represent all of the Native women who've been victims of violence. And this is an image of a transgender woman who was, unfortunately, who was killed in Montana. And her image has come to represent all of the women, all of the Native women, and the issues surrounding with the violence against women on the reservations. One of the issues that has been very difficult for Native people is that when a non-Native person comes onto the reservation and commits a violent act, they cannot be prosecuted or tried on the reservation. So what has happened is a lot of non-Native people have taken advantage of that and have committed these crimes on the reservation and get to walk away because they're not prosecuted. And the idea is that a non-Native person who would go to a trial on the reservation wouldn't get a fair trial. we're the only ones that don't have that. So as much as we talk about legislation and the Violence Against Women Act, for reservation communities, this is a major problem. 1 in 3 Native women, 1 in 3 will suffer some sort of sexual violence against them, and it's an epidemic. This is also Chinupa Hunska-Luger. He's from Standing Rock, and this was another interactive art project that he did. This is mirror paper, and they're put on these shield-like substrates. He did a video to have people create these and come out to Standing Rock and to shield themselves against the violence and allow the law enforcement officials to see themselves reacting to their peaceful protest. And it was an incredible idea. It had an effect. It gained a lot of media attention. The violence that was perpetrated on the reservation is only now being prosecuted, and a lot of the prosecutions, which were arrests of Native people for peacefully protesting, have been thrown out by the criminal courts. So it's these kinds of art projects that end up having a real impact in what is going on in a larger society it's incredible. And Chinupa is one of those artists that is at the forefront of this. This is another piece of his, and I'm going to finish up with a little bit of this and talk about the exhibit that we're going to be doing. But this work was a work of about 10 different ceramic sculptures and metal sculptures called We Have Agency. And these ceramic sculptures are all bound in this black rope, and they're in various positions. You can see some of them are hanging from the wall, but they're all bound. And the one thing is that each of those sculptures has a knife. And the idea is that we have agency. We have the ability to talk about ourselves. We have the ability to unbind ourselves from these restraints. And this particular work of his has had such an effect on me. One of the things that has been frustrating is to see different exhibitions and writing on Native art, and to see that it's not collaborative with Native people, that it ends up becoming a writing about the other. They believe this, they think that. This, for me, these objects talk about how we can talk about us in the first person, and how we can explain who we are and what this means to us. We have agency, and that's and it's within our power to unbind all of the struggles that we've had over the many years, and we can collaborate. One of the things that has been so wonderful about working with Kat and her class has been about this idea of talking about collaboration, talking about allyship, How do you work together to make these kinds of conversations happen? What is it about Native people that you want to learn about? What is it about Native people that you don't understand? Within the continental United States, there are over 567 nations, 567 different tribes of people. That is absolutely astounding that we have that many different kinds of Native peoples, and so few people know about it. That's always been my hope, is to re-educate people about who we are, what we believe in, how we see ourselves fitting into this larger society. And through this exhibit, through what we're doing, what we're talking about, for me is a big part of that collaboration, that allyship, that ability to hear one another and be able to really talk about these issues. I think one of the things that is so impressive in a community like this one is that we have shared experiences. We have the ability to overcome. One of the things we talked about with the title of the exhibition is about survivance. What does that mean? How does that become real? And survivance really is about an active ability to survive, to continue, to evolve. And one of the things that I was especially impressed with was that the collaboration was so open and is so open, and the conversations that we've had have been so eye-opening, and I'm proud to be a part of it. I hope that when the exhibition opens, you all will come back and take a look at what we've put together and collaborated on. It hopefully is going to be an amazing, amazing exhibit. And with that, I'll end. Any questions?
Okay. I wanted to know, is it typical for the more mainstream art that's considered Native American to look Native? And the pieces that you have shown, like, they're obviously beautiful, but are they actually publicized in magazines or museums, or are they hidden?
It's it's very interesting. Yes, there's when you Google Native American art, you're going to get the teepees, and you're going to get the horses and the headdresses and beautiful pieces of art, but that do sort of conform into those stereotypes. These works aren't shown enough, as far as I'm concerned. But if I'm now living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I can say that it is the center of contemporary Native American art. You can go and see some of these very abstract paintings and sculptures in any of the galleries there, and you wouldn't be able to tell what is Native and what is non-Native. I think some of the work, because of that, ends up not being chosen and not being displayed because it doesn't have the feather, it doesn't have the horse, it doesn't represent this preconceived notion of what Native art is. And I think with this exhibition, I think it is going to challenge your idea of what you perceive as Native art and how that has to change within you, to be able to recognize what was I thinking when I saw this piece? How do I see the connection to Native art? Do I need to see the connection to Native art? Does it have to be labeled as Native? All of those things are things that, any artist struggles with. But it's it's not without controversy. I didn't put up two artists, one in particular, who had a big show at the Whitney this past summer. His name's Jimmy Durham, and there's a lot of controversy around him. He, for a long time, claimed Cherokee heritage, and all three Cherokee nations have disavowed him, have said he's not in any way enrolled on our reservations. We can't find any trace of his heritage here. And yet, Jimmy Durham has been collected by the Whitney. Jimmy Durham is at MoMA. Jimmy Durham is at the Tate in London. Jimmy Durham has sold himself as a Native artist. And it's frustrating because for a lot of Native artists, it's hard to sort of push yourself into having those connections, that access to a larger art market. And whether those constraints are your own or whether those constraints are socioeconomic, access to art school, access to all of these other things, he's benefiting from being a Native artist. And the Whitney got a lot of pushback for putting his show up this year. And I think now the Whitney will be collecting some other Native art, hopefully very soon.
Do you mind if I share something from the
Sure.
Another thing from the exhibition planning? One artist that I visited with, I won't name, a young Lakota artist who's here in New York and came to New York about 3 years ago and previously was in LA. We had a lot of conversation about this question, and you mentioned the market. I think also there's this other part of it, which is how artists survive, which is how artists pay their bills and how they build their careers. And her concern was she actually had a very broad market of her work. She sold her work very actively through the internet and through Instagram when she was in LA, and when she was making work that had headdresses and had feathers, and it was in her own way. It was not particularly traditional. It was painting. It looked kind of abstract also, but that work that was being seen, like, could be read as Native by non-Native people, she was making a really good living on it. But she was interested in shifting, and has shifted her work quite a bit, to being more abstract, to being more conceptual. And it still deals with identity. And she said, that is one of the things I've been battling with. How do I talk about who I am and where I'm from, but also retain actually the monetary support that I've gotten from making work that looks Native. And we talked about some artists like Jean Quick-to-See Smith, who's an elder, like a Native American artist who's been working, who's Salish from Kootenai from Montana, and has since for 30, 40 years built a career on giving you a little bit of what you expect and putting a lot in that she wants to show you. Yeah. And that maybe not everybody will read, but that maybe some people will read, and some people will take the time to read. But I think it's a complicated path. So it's a great question. Are there other questions? Yes.
In today's world, DNA is very big, and do the nations actually use that nowadays as a way to enroll? Why won't they do that?
Well, okay, so two things. First, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, all of those things. If you look at their genetic markers, there is one genetic marker for the entire Western Hemisphere. So everybody kind of has a little bit of Native American because you're talking about half of the globe. And for me, that is, again, the idea of identity is with my heritage. So I'm a quarter Irish, a quarter German, and half Oglala Lakota. I've chosen my Native heritage as my identifier. And I think one of the things about finding out how much Native American you are is that it again wipes out any kind of distinguishing characteristic, distinguishing heritage that you may have. For me, it's much more of, I would have a lot more respect for someone who comes to the reservation and says, you know, can I see if my ancestors were here? And the tribal rolls are not open to Ancestry.com. And so connecting yourself to this is usually done through communities, and maybe your ancestor comes from a particular community where there's a large Native population. Now all of a sudden you're part Native. It's really digging down into those things. You know, the nomenclature is difficult. One of the most asked questions for me is, what do you want to be called? Are you Native American? Are you American Indian? Are you Native? Are you Indigenous? What is it that how you identify? And for me, I identify as Oglala Lakota. That's my tribe. And I think any Native person would want to be identified by their tribe, by their specific connection to the land, to where they're from. And a lot of the art that you would see has that, resonates in those things that are connected to the land, connected to place, connected to having roots somewhere. And it's important. It's important. But no, anyone who says that they've done their DNA and they have Native American heritage, okay, you're part of half the globe, because there are no distinguishing markers for Native tribes.
Is there other questions? Julio's got a mic for you right there.
I was wondering if, while you were in Europe, did you happen to notice how Native American artists were labeled? Is it kind of just a blanket statement as like Native American? I mean, even here, tribal names are not especially well known. And then also in Europe and also in America, how do you find Native artists who aren't able to enroll themselves into a tribal nation? How do they identify themselves, or how do museums identify them in their labels if they cannot technically say that they are part of a nation? How do they then label the artist?
That's an excellent question. First, your first question, in Europe, contemporary art, where I did find it, they did have native nations named, and specific tribes. For the non-contemporary art or the ethnographic art, it became a little less specific. So it would be Northern Plains, or very, very regional in its description of what these things were. When I was in Florence, there's the Museum of Anthropology there, which was part of the Medici collection. So we came to this section, and the young woman who was guiding us through the exhibit, there was a hide dress, and the hide was very creamy white, and I recognized it as kind of a northwestern, maybe plateau area, Idaho, eastern Washington, eastern Oregon tribes through the designs, and they were very large beads, so which was a little bit older in terms of trade beads. And the young woman describes to us that this was the wedding dress of the very first Native woman to marry a white man from this tribe. And I just thought, if you had that much specific information about this particular dress, why don't you have any of the other information? It was just labeled as a plains dress, and it wasn't a plains dress. And for me, it's those kinds of things, the perpetuation of these kind of stereotypes. Was this a young woman's dress, or was this an older woman's dress? Why is it this was a white sailor who married this woman or explorer? Those kinds of, that kind of story, that it was very frustrating to hear. And then I would turn around and I would see my own tribal patrimonial objects, and they were pipes. And so in our tradition, you never put the pipe together, the pipe stem and the bowl. You only do that when you're going to use it for ceremony. And all of these were displayed apart. And they had sage in them, and sage is an important part of our ceremonies. You burn sage to bless yourself. I think people all know what smudging is, but you cleanse yourself with the smoke from the sage. And these pipes had sage in them, and it wasn't Italian sage; it was sage from home. I could tell it was our sage, and that was just baffling to me. It was like, how do you know to do that? And yet you're telling me about this, mythical, the first woman ever to marry a white man in a dress. How this dichotomy. What ended up happening was I found out that there was a delegation of people from my home reservation that had gone over to Florence many years before and had brought sage to leave with different museums and collections. And they had told the curators that you don't put those pipes together, and when you have them out on display, they should be stuffed with the sage. And to me, it was an incredible, they took that information and they used it in that display, and yet they're still telling this story about this young woman marrying, the explorer. And you see glimpses of hope and understanding, and then you don't. And so that was difficult. And your second question, I'm trying to remember it now, I talked so much.
How Native people that can't register,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
One of the things, there's the Arts and Crafts Act. I can't remember the full title of it.
I don't remember the full title either, but
there is an act of Congress that basically says you can't label your work as Native American work unless you are enrolled member of a tribe. And ostensibly that was to protect enrolled peoples from being exploited, maybe work that was being imported in and then sold as Native American. So there's a reason for the legislation. But if you were never enrolled, for instance, if one of my sons was an artist, he technically, until he's enrolled, could not call himself a Native American artist. And that, it's frustrating, but at the same time, it's important that with the Jimmy Durhams of the world, that you end up, understanding who is and who isn't. And so it's a bit of a dichotomy. We want this label, but we don't want this label. And it ends up, a lot of artists struggle with it. I'm trying to think, Fritz Scholder, who was Luiseño from California, he didn't like to use his native heritage, used a lot of native imagery, but a lot of people didn't know that he was native. Rauschenberg, trying to think of some of the others. Yeah.
I mean, I think, do you mind if I contribute?
No.
The law, of course, wouldn't be the case in Europe, so that particular issue. But here, this is something that happens currently, especially, I think, post the Jimmy Durham exhibition, that there are, I've personally known a number of cases where there's artists who've, enrollment is closed, so for their entire reservation, for their entire nation, so they actually cannot enroll regardless of how much they are a part of that community. Or they choose not to enroll because they see enrollment as a marker of the U.S. government, not of something of their people. And then, and for either of those reasons, if they're not enrolled, an institution, Native American department or Native American or Art of the Americas collection saying, I'm sorry, we can't exhibit this work, we can't show this work because of your choosing to or not able to be enrolled. So that is happening. And my impression is it's happening in the U.S. more since the Jimmy Durham exhibition. Can you speak to that in Europe just a little more, whether this is different or to follow up on that question?
Because there's so few contemporary collections on display, it really isn't a problem in Europe because but then Jimmy Durham is representing all of us in the Tate collection or in the British Museum or in any of the other museums that he's been collected by. And so it's frustrating, but I think as more art, contemporary Native art, reaches a larger audience, that those issues will become less and less. Because I think, people like Chanupa and, I'm drawing a blank. Some of these other artists that have been collected by these museums, for instance, that exhibit I talked about in Zurich, they bought all the pieces. And so they collected everybody's art in that one show. One of the pieces was too large for them to store, and so Google happened to be opening up a headquarters, and this particular art piece is made of the green boards, the motherboards, and is now on display, on permanent display in Google headquarters in Zurich. So I can't remember his name. The artist. I'm going to have to write his name on my pen. But he, this particular piece is now permanently loaned in that space. Incredible for an institution to do something like this. And this institution, I'm not kidding you, is as big as this room. And yet they're having some of the most incredible exhibits of contemporary art. They were doing Yupik, the cartoon art, the line drawing art. It really, really incredible, forward-thinking exhibitions of contemporary art that we're not seeing here, or we're not seeing in New York, I should say. We're seeing in Santa Fe. We're seeing it Denver Art. We're seeing it Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Idle George. So there are museums in the U.S. who are really focusing on trying to to bring contemporary Native art into an American art setting. And I think October 4th, the Diker collection will be opening at the Met in the American wing. So being moved out of that big Pacific Islanders, Oceania, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. This particular collection being put into the American wing along with American art, that's a first step.
Danielle, I think that might be a perfect place to end the formal conversation. But so I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is amazing, and thank everybody who's been here and part of the audience. There are snacks and drinks and so forth, so people can continue informal conversation. I want to remind students to sign in if they didn't already, and please complete the surveys because everything's free here, and this allows for us to make better programming if we understand what works. So let's thank Danielle warmly for this amazing conversation.
Thank you.